When the drunken cowboys sold Jacob Morrison, a frightened Chinese woman, as a cruel joke, they never imagined she would transform from a broken refugee into the most respected teacher in the Wyoming Territory. But as their forbidden love faces a lynch mob's rope and the scrutiny of an entire frontier town, will their bond prove stronger than the hatred determined to destroy them? The Wyoming dust kicked up like angry spirits as Jacob Morrison's boots hit the wooden porch of Murphy's saloon. August heat in 1867 made everything shimmer like a bad dream, and the smell of unwashed men and cheap whiskey burned his nose. At 32, Jacob had seen enough frontier towns to know trouble when it walked through swinging doors, but today the trouble was already waiting inside. "Well, look what the prairie wind blew in." Buck Henley's voice cut through the smoky air like a dull knife. The man sat hunched over a poker table with 3 other cowboys, his yellow teeth showing in what might have been a grin. "Jacob Morrison, the loneliest rancher in all of Cedar Creek." Jacob ignored the laughter that followed. He'd come for supplies, not conversation, but Buck never let an opportunity for cruelty pass by. The other men at the table watched with the hungry eyes of vultures circling a dying animal. "I got something that might fix your problem, Morrison," Buck continued, gesturing toward the darkest corner of the saloon. "Fresh off the railroad, can't speak English worth a damn, but she'll cook your beans and warm your bed." Jacob's eyes followed Buck's pointing finger, and what he saw made his stomach turn. A young Chinese woman sat crammed into the corner like a forgotten piece of luggage. Her black hair hung in tangles around a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't marked by exhaustion and fear. Her silk dress, once beautiful, was now torn and stained with the dirt of 1,000 miles. But it was her eyes that stopped Jacob cold. Most beaten-down folks had empty stares, like looking into abandoned wells. This woman's eyes burned with intelligence and defiance, even as her small hands shook with terror. "She ain't for sale, Buck," Jacob said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of a man used to being heard. "Everything's for sale out here, friend." Buck's grin widened, showing more of those rotten teeth. "Question is, what's it worth to you?" "I'm thinking $50 would be fair. Hell, I paid $60 for my last horse, and this one's already housebroken." The cruel laughter that followed made Jacob's hands clench into fists. Around the saloon, conversations had stopped. Even the piano player had quit his tune. Everyone sensed that something important was about to happen, the kind of moment that gets talked about for years afterward. Jacob reached into his money pouch, feeling the weight of gold coins earned through backbreaking work under the prairie sun. $50 represented weeks of labor, of rising before dawn to tend cattle, of mending fences until his hands bled. "I'll take her," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. The words came out before he could think them through, driven by something deeper than logic, but not as property, as help, fair wages, fair treatment. Buck's laughter boomed across the saloon like thunder before a storm. "You always were soft, Morrison. Don't come crying to me when she runs off with your silver spoons." The woman watched this exchange with alert eyes that seemed to understand more than her captors realized. When Jacob approached her, she pressed herself against the wall, but she didn't look away. He stopped just beyond arm's reach and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage. "My name is Jacob. I won't hurt you." She tilted her head slightly, studying his face like she was reading words written there. Something in his tone, or maybe the way he kept his distance, seemed to reach her. When he extended his hand, not to grab, but to offer, she stared at it for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, she placed her small fingers in his palm. The moment their skin touched, Jacob felt something shift inside his chest. Her hand was rough with calluses, the hand of someone who knew hard work. A jade bracelet, her only remaining treasure, caught the light filtering through dirty windows. "There's your 50, Jacob said, dropping the gold coins on Buck's table with deliberate care. Each coin rang against the wood like a bell, tolling the end of something terrible and the beginning of something unknown. Buck scooped up the money with greedy fingers, but his eyes held a promise of future trouble. "Pleasure doing business, Morrison. Hope you don't regret it." As Jacob led the woman toward the door, he heard Buck's voice behind him, quieter now but somehow more dangerous. "Remember, Morrison, what's bought can always be sold again. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jacob didn't turn around, but he felt the weight of hostile eyes following them out into the blazing afternoon sun. The woman walked beside him with careful steps, her head held high despite everything she'd endured. Neither of them spoke during the short walk to where Jacob's horse waited. The animal, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, snorted softly as they approached. The woman stopped suddenly, staring at the horse with something that might have been wonder. "Have you ridden before?" Jacob asked. She shook her head, but when he offered to help her up, she accepted with dignity that impressed him. As she settled behind him on the saddle, Jacob felt her hands grip his belt with desperate strength. The ride out of town passed in careful silence, broken only by Belle's steady hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through tall grass. Jacob could feel the woman's tension in the way she held herself, rigid as a board, but he also sensed her relief at leaving Cedar Creek behind. As they crested a low hill, Jacob's ranch came into view. The house wasn't much, just a simple wooden structure nestled among cottonwood trees, but it was honest and clean, with a garden patch and a small barn that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. "There," Jacob said, pointing toward home. "That's where we're headed." The woman followed his gesture, and for the first time since he'd seen her, her posture relaxed slightly. Whatever she saw in that modest homestead seemed to offer hope after weeks or maybe months of having none at all. Inside Jacob's house, silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. The woman stood in the middle of his simple front room, taking in details with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that survival meant noticing everything. Clean wooden floors, a stone fireplace, windows that actually had glass, small luxuries that meant safety after the nightmare she'd escaped. Jacob moved to the kitchen and returned with a basin of clean water and a soft towel. He set them on the table and stepped back, giving her space. The woman stared at the water like it might be a mirage, then looked up at him with questions in her dark eyes. "For washing," he said gently, then pointed to himself. "Jacob." He gestured toward her with raised eyebrows, an invitation rather than a demand. She hesitated, touching her throat with nervous fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Lee May." "Lee May," Jacob repeated, trying to match the way her tongue shaped the sounds. Her eyes widened with something that might have been surprise, or maybe gratitude that he'd bothered to try. He showed her to the spare bedroom, a small but clean space with a real bed, and a window that looked out over the creek. Lee May touched the quilt with trembling fingers, as if afraid it might disappear. When Jacob left her alone to wash and rest, he heard the soft sound of crying through the thin walls. But by evening, the tears had stopped. Lee May emerged from the bedroom wearing the same torn dress, but her face was clean, and her hair had been braided back neatly. She'd found the kitchen and was examining his meager supplies with the focused attention of someone planning a campaign. "I cook?" she asked, holding up a bag of beans and some bacon. Jacob nodded, then watched in amazement as Lee May transformed his simple ingredients into something that actually smelled good. She worked with quick, efficient movements, adding pinches of wild herbs she'd somehow identified during their short ride to the ranch. They ate in comfortable quiet, but afterward, as Jacob sat on his front porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and red, he heard something that made him stop breathing. Lee May was singing, softly, almost under her breath, but the melody was so beautiful, it made his chest ache. The song spoke of longing and loss, of mountains far away and flowers that bloomed in a different kind of spring. Jacob didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling behind them. It was the sound of someone remembering home while trying to build courage for whatever came next. The next morning brought their first real test. Lee May had risen before dawn, old habits from whatever life she'd left behind, and was already working in Jacob's pathetic excuse for a garden when he stumbled outside with his coffee. "This soil is sick," she said, mixing English words with gestures toward the scraggly plants. "Need medicine." Jacob frowned. "Medicine? For plants?" Lee May nodded seriously. then led him to the creek bank where she began collecting what looked like weeds to his untrained eye. But as she worked, explaining in her broken English mixed with hand signals, Jacob began to understand that these weren't random plants. She knew their names, their properties, how they worked together to heal sick earth. Within an hour, Lee May had diagnosed problems with his soil that Jacob had been fighting for 3 years without understanding. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd been trained from childhood, her hands moving through the earth like she was reading a language written in dirt and roots. "How do you know all this?" Jacob asked, genuinely amazed. Lee May paused in her work, considering how to explain with her limited English. "My grandmother," she said finally. "She teach me. Plants, medicine, growing things." Her voice carried a weight of loss that made Jacob's throat tighten. "She sounds like a wise woman." "Was wise," Lee May corrected softly. "Now she is with ancestors." She touched the jade bracelet on her wrist, and Jacob understood that it represented more than jewelry. It was a connection to everything she'd left behind. By midday, Jacob's garden looked completely different. Lee May had reorganized the plants, created new drainage channels, and applied her mysterious plant medicines to soil that had been struggling to support even the toughest vegetables. She worked without complaint, despite the heat, stopping only to drink water from the creek. "Lee May," Jacob said as they sat in the shade eating bread and cheese for lunch, "why did you come to America?" Her face grew serious, and for a moment Jacob thought she wouldn't answer. Then she began to speak, slowly at first, then with growing confidence as she found the English words she needed. Her family had sent her ahead, she explained, believing promises of work and prosperity that would allow her to send money home. She'd been supposed to work as a seamstress in San Francisco, but the man who'd arranged her passage had other plans. Instead of the honest work she'd been promised, she'd been sold from person to person like cargo, each transaction taking her further from the life she'd expected to build. "I was stupid," she said bitterly. "I believed promises that were lies." "You weren't stupid," Jacob said firmly. "You were betrayed by people who took advantage of your trust. That's not the same thing." Lee May looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You are different from other men I have met in America." "How so?" "You see me as person, not as thing to be used." She gestured toward the garden they'd transformed together. "You let me work with you, not just for you." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance over the prairie grass, Lee May asked the question Jacob had been dreading. "What happens when you grow tired of me? When you decide I am too much trouble?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Lee May, I can't promise you'll want to stay here forever. This is hard country, and lonely sometimes. But I can promise that as long as you do want to stay, you'll have a place here. Not as property, not as servant, but as—" he struggled to find the right word. "As family, I suppose. As someone who belongs." Lee May's eyes glistened in the starlight. In China, family is everything. But family can also be prison, especially for women. Here, maybe family can be choice instead of obligation. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its voice carrying across the vast emptiness that surrounded them. Instead of sounding lonely, though, it sounded like a call to something wild and free. "Jacob," Lee May said softly, "I think maybe I am beginning to understand what America means." "What's that?" "America means second chances," she replied, "for people like us who don't fit the shapes other people want to make us." As they sat in comfortable silence, neither of them noticed the rider watching from the ridge above their property, or saw him turn his horse toward town, with news that would soon set the entire territory talking. Change was coming to Cedar Creek, whether they were ready or not. 3 weeks after Lee May's arrival, Jacob's horse collapsed in the middle of his pasture, foam dripping from its mouth like soap bubbles. The animal's eyes rolled white with pain as it thrashed against the ground, and Jacob felt his heart sink. Without Thunder, his strongest workhorse, the ranch would struggle to survive the coming winter. "Hold still, boy," Jacob whispered, kneeling beside the suffering animal. But Thunder's breathing came in harsh gasps, and his left front leg hung at an angle that meant serious trouble. Li Mei appeared at Jacob's shoulder like a shadow, carrying a cloth bag filled with plants she'd been gathering by the creek. Without asking permission, she knelt beside Thunder and placed her small hands on his neck, feeling for something Jacob couldn't understand. "Poison plant," she said quietly, her fingers moving along Thunder's jaw. "He eats something bad near water." Jacob's stomach dropped. Poison meant death for horses. He'd seen it happen before, and there was nothing any frontier veterinarian could do. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering, Li Mei opened her plant bag and began sorting through leaves and roots with the speed of someone who'd done this countless times. Her fingers worked like a pianist playing a familiar song, crushing some plants, bundling others, creating what looked like medicine from what Jacob had always thought were weeds. "My grandfather was horse doctor in China," she explained while working. "He teach me about sick animals before he teach me about sick people." For the next 6 hours, Li Mei fought for Thunder's life with a determination that amazed Jacob. She mixed plant medicines into water and somehow convinced the horse to drink. She created poultices that drew poison from his system. Most importantly, she stayed calm when Jacob wanted to panic, her quiet confidence keeping both man and animal steady. As the sun set behind the mountains, Thunder finally struggled to his feet. His breathing had returned to normal, and the wild fear had left his eyes. Li Mei sat back on her heels, exhausted but victorious. "He will live," she said simply, as if saving a horse's life was something she did every Tuesday. Jacob stared at her with new understanding. This wasn't just a woman who could cook and clean. This was someone with skills that could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster on the frontier. More than that, she'd worked alongside him without being asked, taking responsibility for his problems as if they were her own. "Li Mei," he said carefully, "how much do you know about medicine? For people, I mean." She shrugged, suddenly modest. "Some things. My grandmother teach me about herbs, about healing, but I am not real doctor." "Maybe not," Jacob replied, watching Thunder drink from the water trough with steady appetite. "But you just did something I've never seen anyone else do. That horse was dying, and you brought him back." That night, word of Thunder's miraculous recovery spread through Cedar Creek faster than news of gold strikes. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the general store, rode out to the ranch with her youngest boy, who'd been suffering from a cough that wouldn't quit. "I heard tell your Chinese girl knows something about healing," she said to Jacob, though her eyes kept drifting to Li Mei with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Li Mei examined little Tommy Patterson with gentle hands, asking questions in her improving English about when the cough started and what it sounded like. She prepared a tea from plants that grew wild around the ranch, and within 2 days, Tommy's cough had disappeared completely. More visitors followed. Old Pete Rawlings brought his arthritic hands for Li Mei to examine. Sarah Walsh, the school teacher, came seeking help for headaches that had plagued her for months. Each time, Li Mei listened carefully, diagnosed thoughtfully, and provided treatments that actually worked. But success brought its own problems. Buck Henley began visiting Murphy's saloon more frequently, his complaints about Jacob and Li Mei growing louder and more bitter with each drink. "It ain't natural," he told anyone who'd listen. "White folks going to a heathen for doctoring. Next thing you know, she'll be thinking she's better than decent Christian women." His audience varied depending on the night and how much whiskey had been consumed, but his message remained constant. Li Mei represented a threat to the natural order of things, and something needed to be done about it. Meanwhile, Li Mei was discovering talents she hadn't known she possessed. Working alongside Jacob had awakened skills that had been dormant during her difficult journey to America. She redesigned his irrigation system using techniques her grandfather had taught her. She improved his crop rotation schedule, increasing his harvest by nearly a third. Most surprising of all, she began teaching Jacob to read Chinese characters in the evenings, while he helped her improve her English grammar. These quiet hours on the porch, working by lamplight while coyotes called in the distance, became the best part of both their days. "Your writing is getting better," Li Mei said one evening, examining Jacob's attempt to write his name in Chinese brushstrokes. "Your English is getting better too," Jacob replied. "Sometimes I forget you've only been here a few weeks." Li Mei set down her brush and looked out over the prairie, where the first autumn stars were beginning to appear. "Jacob, I must tell you something important." The seriousness in her voice made him look up from his writing practice. "What is it?" "People in town are talking about us. About what kind of arrangement we have here." She struggled to find polite words for impolite gossip. "Some say I am your wife. Others say I am your woman for pleasure. Mrs. Walsh warned me that questions are being asked." Jacob felt his face grow hot with anger, though not at Li Mei. "What kind of questions?" "Whether we sleep in same room, whether you bought me for things good women don't discuss." Li Mei's cheeks flushed, but she continued steadily. "Buck Henley is telling people that I am corrupting decent folks with foreign ways, and that you are setting bad example for other men." The weight of small-town judgment settled on Jacob's shoulders like a heavy coat. He'd known this conversation would come eventually, but he'd hoped to avoid it longer. Cedar Creek was the kind of place where reputation mattered more than truth, and where rumors could destroy lives faster than prairie fires destroyed grass. "What do you think we should do?" he asked. Li Mei was quiet for a long moment, her fingers playing with her jade bracelet. "In China, unmarried man and woman cannot live together, even for good reasons. It brings shame to families, makes problems for everyone." Jacob's heart began to race, though he wasn't sure if it was from hope or fear. "And what does that mean for us?" "It means," Li Mei said carefully, "that we must decide what kind of life we want to build together, as partners working towards same goals, or as two people sharing house for convenience." The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Jacob looked at Li Mei, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened refugee he'd rescued from Buck Henley's cruelty, but a strong, intelligent woman who'd become essential to his happiness in ways he was only beginning to understand. Before he could answer, thunder's sharp whinny cut through the evening air. Both Jacob and Li Mei jumped to their feet, instantly alert. The horse was staring toward the road, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring. In the distance, barely visible in the gathering darkness, a rider sat motionless on the ridge overlooking their property. As they watched, the figure turned and disappeared into the night, but not before Jacob caught a glimpse of Buck Henley's distinctive silhouette. "He's been watching us," Li Mei said quietly. Jacob nodded grimly. "The question is, what's he planning to do about it?" Dawn brought visitors Jacob hadn't expected, and some he definitely hadn't wanted. Sarah Walsh arrived first, her usually neat hair disheveled, and her face flushed with the kind of excitement that meant either very good news or very bad trouble. "Jacob, Li Mei," she called, practically tumbling off her horse in her hurry to reach the porch. "You need to hear this before anyone else tells you." Li Mei emerged from the chicken coop with a basket of eggs, while Jacob set down the fence post he'd been preparing to install. Sarah's obvious agitation made both of them instantly wary. "What's wrong?" Jacob asked. "It's not wrong exactly," Sarah said, catching her breath. "It's just unexpected. There's a man in town from the Territorial Education Department, Dr. Marcus Webb. He's been asking questions about Li Mei." Li Mei went very still, the egg basket forgotten in her hands. "What kind of questions?" "Good questions," Sarah said quickly, seeing Li Mei's fear. "He heard about your healing work, but also about how you've been helping me with some of the children who struggle with reading. Word got back to the territorial capital that we have someone here with unusual teaching abilities." Jacob felt a mixture of pride and worry. Recognition of Li Mei's talents was wonderful, but attention from government officials could complicate their already precarious situation. "He wants to meet with you," Sarah continued, "this afternoon at the schoolhouse. He's particularly interested in your methods for teaching mathematics and your knowledge of what he called practical sciences." Before Li Mei could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced more visitors. This time it was Buck Henley with 3 companions, their faces set in grim lines that promised confrontation. "Well, well," Buck called out as he reined his horse to a stop near the porch. "Looks like we got ourselves a regular social gathering here." Sarah Walsh straightened her shoulders and faced Buck with the authority of an educated woman who wasn't easily intimidated. Mr. Henley, we were having a private conversation. Nothing private about what concerns the moral welfare of our community, Buck replied, his eyes fixed on Li Mei with undisguised hostility, especially when it involves foreign influences corrupting our children. Li Mei stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance despite the obvious danger. I have done nothing to harm any child. I help them learn, help them grow strong and smart. Buck's laugh was harsh and ugly. You help them forget their place. More like teaching them heathen ideas, making them think your foreign ways are as good as Christian ways. What heathen ideas? Sarah Walsh demanded, her teacher's instincts rising to defend her students. Arithmetic? Geography? Reading comprehension? Because those are the subjects Li Mei has been helping with, and test scores have improved dramatically since she started. One of Buck's companions, a thin man named Pete Rawlings, spoke up for the first time. It ain't just the teaching, Sarah. It's the example she's setting. Living in sin with Morrison, acting like she's got the same rights as decent white women. Jacob had heard enough. He stepped between Buck's group and Li Mei, his hands loose but ready. That's enough. Li Mei lives here as my employee. Nothing more, nothing less. She earns her keep through honest work, and she's free to leave any time she chooses. Employee? Buck's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. That what you're calling it now? Because from where I sit, it looks like you bought yourself a concubine and you're trying to pretty it up with fancy words. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Jacob felt his temper rising, but Li Mei's voice cut through his anger before he could respond. Mr. Henley, she said in a voice that carried surprising authority, you speak of Christian values, but I see no kindness in your words. You speak of moral behavior, but I see no charity in your actions. Perhaps you should examine your own heart before judging others. Buck's face turned red with rage. You uppity little... Careful, Buck. Dr. Marcus Webb's cultured voice interrupted Buck's crude response. The government official had appeared as if from nowhere, sitting astride a fine black horse and wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as someone with real authority. Dr. Webb, Sarah said with obvious relief, I was just telling Jacob and Li Mei about your visit. Dr. Webb dismounted with the easy grace of a man comfortable in any social situation. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. More importantly, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mr. Henley, isn't it? Dr. Webb said pleasantly. I've heard quite a bit about you during my short time in Cedar Creek, all very illuminating. Buck shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Dr. Webb, didn't expect to see you out here. No, I imagine you didn't. Dr. Webb's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath the politeness. I came to meet the remarkable young woman I've been hearing about. The one whose innovative teaching methods have attracted attention all the way to the territorial capital. He turned to Li Mei with a respectful nod. Miss Chen, I presume? I'm Dr. Marcus Webb, Director of Educational Development for Wyoming Territory. I've been very impressed by the reports I've received about your work. Li Mei looked uncertain, glancing between Dr. Webb and the still hostile faces of Buck's group. I am honored to meet you, Dr. Webb, but I am not sure what reports you mean. Reports of dramatic improvements in student performance wherever you've been involved in teaching, Dr. Webb explained. Reports of innovative approaches to mathematics and natural sciences that have produced remarkable results. Reports, in short, of exactly the kind of educational leadership we desperately need on the frontier. Buck's face had gone from red to purple. Now hold on just a minute. Mr. Henley, Dr. Webb interrupted smoothly. I wonder if you might have business elsewhere. I have official territorial business to discuss, and I'd prefer to conduct it without an audience. It was a polite dismissal, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Buck looked around at his companions, searching for support, but they were already turning their horses toward the road. Government officials weren't people you argued with, especially when your own reputation was less than spotless. This ain't over, Buck muttered, but he was already backing his horse away from the confrontation. After Buck's group had disappeared, Dr. Webb turned his full attention to Li Mei. Miss Chen, Would you be willing to demonstrate some of your teaching methods? I have particular interest in how you approach mathematical concepts with students who have previously struggled. Li Mei looked to Jacob, who nodded encouragingly. I would be happy to show you, Dr. Webb, but I must warn you, my methods are not traditional American ways. Dr. Webb smiled. Miss Chen, if traditional American methods were working, I wouldn't be here looking for alternatives. The frontier demands innovation, and from what I've observed, innovation is exactly what you provide. As they prepared to head toward the schoolhouse, Jacob caught Li Mei's eye. The fear that had marked her early weeks at the ranch was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who had found her true calling. But even as they celebrated this unexpected opportunity, none of them noticed Buck Henley watching from the distant ridge. His face twisted with a hatred that had moved far beyond simple prejudice into something much more dangerous. The real test was still to come. The Cedar Creek schoolhouse had never held so many adults during regular school hours, but word of Dr. Webb's visit had spread like wildfire through the small frontier town. Parents who normally spent their days working ranches and shops had found excuses to witness this unusual demonstration. Crowding into the back of the one-room building where their children usually struggled with basic lessons. Li Mei stood before 32 pairs of curious eyes, her hands steady despite the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She had chosen to demonstrate with the most challenging students, the ones who had been labeled as slow learners or troublemakers by previous teachers. Tommy, she said gently to a freckled boy of 8, who usually spent more time staring out windows than at his slate, if you have 3 apples and you give one to your sister, how many do you have left? Tommy squirmed in his seat, the familiar panic of being asked a question he couldn't answer flickering across his face. But instead of demanding an immediate response, Li Mei reached into a basket and pulled out 3 real apples. Here, she said, placing the fruit on Tommy's desk. Show me with these. The boy's eyes widened with understanding. Physical objects made sense in ways that numbers on a slate never had. He carefully moved 1 apple aside, then counted what remained. 2! He said with genuine excitement. Dr. Webb leaned forward in his chair, clearly intrigued. This wasn't the rote memorization approach used in most frontier schools, where children were expected to learn through endless repetition and the threat of punishment. Li Mei moved through the room, presenting each struggling student with problems they could touch, manipulate, and understand through their hands, as well as their minds. She used beans for counting, strips of cloth for measuring, and even small stones to demonstrate basic principles of addition and subtraction. But it was when she moved to more advanced concepts that the real magic happened. 12-year-old Mary Patterson had always been considered too slow for complex arithmetic, but Li Mei approached her with a completely different method. Mary, you help your mother in the store, yes? Li Mei asked. Mary nodded shyly. If a customer buys 3 yards of fabric at 25 cents per yard, how much money should they pay? Instead of panic, Mary's face showed concentration. Li Mei had connected the mathematics to something Mary already understood, the daily reality of running a business. 75 cents, Mary said after a moment of careful thought. Very good. Now, if they pay with $1, how much change do you give them? 25 cents, Mary replied with growing confidence. Dr. Webb was taking notes now, his pen moving rapidly across his notebook. Around the room, parents were exchanging glances of amazement. These were the same children who had been struggling with basic lessons just weeks before. Li Mei concluded her demonstration by having the students work together on a real problem, calculating how much grain would be needed to feed the school's chickens through the winter. She divided them into groups, with stronger students helping weaker ones, turning learning into a cooperative effort rather than a competitive struggle. Remarkable, Dr. Webb murmured to Sarah Walsh. She's not just teaching different content, she's teaching in an entirely different way. When the demonstration ended, parents approached Li Mei with questions about their children's progress. Mrs. Patterson, who had initially been skeptical about having a Chinese woman involved in her daughter's education, now sought Li Mei's advice about Mary's future schooling. She's like a different child, Mrs. Patterson admitted, At home, she started helping with the store's bookkeeping. She actually enjoys working with numbers now. But not everyone in the crowded schoolhouse was pleased. Buck Henley had positioned himself near the back door, his face growing darker with each parent's praise for Lee May's methods. When Dr. Webb began discussing the possibility of Lee May training other teachers throughout the territory, Buck's patience finally snapped. "This is all very pretty," he announced loudly, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. "But we're forgetting something important here. This woman ain't qualified to teach American children. She's a heathen who don't share our values or our faith." Dr. Webb's expression didn't change, but his voice carried new authority when he responded. "Mr. Henley, are you questioning the territorial government's ability to evaluate educational qualifications?" Buck's face flushed, but he pressed on. "I'm questioning whether we should let foreign influences corrupt our children's minds. What's she teaching them about American history? About Christian morality? About the proper order of things?" Lee May had been listening to this exchange with growing tension, but now she stepped forward with the quiet dignity that had impressed so many people over the past weeks. "Mr. Henley," she said clearly, "I teach children to think for themselves, to solve problems, to work together with respect for each other. If these are not American values, then perhaps you should explain to me what American values really are." The challenge was delivered with such calm reasonableness that it caught Buck off guard. Several parents nodded in agreement, and Dr. Webb's slight smile suggested approval. "Furthermore," Lee May continued, "I have been studying your Constitution and your Declaration of Independence. They speak of equality, of justice, of the right to pursue happiness, regardless of where someone was born. Are these not the values you want children to learn?" Buck's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had expected to intimidate Lee May with his bluster, but instead found himself being lectured on American principles by someone who seemed to understand them better than he did. That's not the point," he stammered. "The point is, you don't belong here, teaching our children, living in sin with Morrison, acting like you're as good as decent white women." The accusation about her living situation hit its mark. Lee May's composed expression faltered slightly, and Jacob tensed from his position near the windows. This was the attack they had both been dreading, the one that struck at her reputation and, by extension, her right to participate in community life. Dr. Webb stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor in the sudden silence. "Mr. Henley, I think this conversation has moved far beyond educational policy. Perhaps it's time for you to leave." But Buck wasn't finished. The whiskey he'd been drinking to build his courage was making him reckless. "You can't just ignore the moral questions here, Dr. Webb. This woman is corrupting our community, and Morrison is helping her do it. Something needs to be done before." "Before what?" Jacob's voice cut through Buck's rant like a blade. He had moved to stand beside Lee May, his presence both protective and defiant. "Before she helps more children learn to read? Before she teaches them to think critically? Before she shows them that people from different places might have valuable knowledge to share?" The confrontation had reached a tipping point. Parents were choosing sides with their eyes, their body language, their subtle movements closer to or farther from the central conflict. Webb was clearly evaluating not just Lee May's teaching abilities, but the community's readiness to accept change. And in the center of it all, Lee May stood quietly, her jade bracelet catching the afternoon light as she faced the man who wanted to destroy everything she had worked to build. "Mr. Henley," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her, "you are afraid of me not because I am different, but because I am succeeding. You cannot bear the thought that someone you consider inferior might actually have something valuable to offer." The truth of her words hit the crowded schoolhouse like a thunderclap. In that moment, everyone present understood that this wasn't really about education or morality or proper social order. This was about fear, the fear of a man who had built his identity on believing himself superior to others, now faced with evidence that his assumptions might be wrong. Buck Henley's face went white, then red, then white again. When he finally spoke, His voice shook with rage. "This ain't over. Not by a long shot." As he stormed out of the schoolhouse, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, everyone knew he was right. The real battle was just beginning. 3 days after the schoolhouse confrontation, Jacob woke to find his prize bull lying dead in the pasture, foam still clinging to its mouth. The massive animal that had been perfectly healthy the evening before was now stiff and cold, its eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky. Li Mei knelt beside the dead bull, her fingers examining the grass around its mouth with the focused attention of someone trained to read signs others missed. "Poison," she said grimly, holding up a wilted plant that didn't belong in Jacob's carefully maintained pasture. "Someone put this here during the night." Jacob's hands clenched into fists as the implications sank in. The bull had been worth more than most men made in a year. Its loss would seriously damage the ranch's breeding program and its financial future. More importantly, whoever had done this had trespassed on his land and deliberately destroyed his property. Who would do such a thing? Jacob asked, though they both already knew the answer. Li Mei stood up, brushing dirt from her skirt with movements that were calm but deliberate. "Someone who wants to hurt you for helping me. Someone who thinks fear will make us change our minds about living the way we choose." Over the next week, the attacks escalated. Jacob's irrigation channels were mysteriously blocked with rocks and debris. His vegetable garden was trampled by horses that had somehow gotten loose during the night. Fences were cut, allowing cattle to wander onto neighboring property, where they caused damage Jacob had to pay for. But the most insidious attack came in the form of whispered rumors that spread through Cedar Creek like poison in a water supply. Buck Henley had become a master of innuendo, never making direct accusations but dropping hints that painted Jacob and Li Mei's relationship in the worst possible light. "I ain't saying anything improper is happening out at the Morrison place," he would tell anyone who'd listen, "but it sure is curious how that Chinese woman has him wrapped around her little finger. Makes a man wonder what kind of influence and she's using on him." The rumors found fertile ground among people already uncomfortable with change. Mrs. Henshaw stopped buying eggs from Jacob's chickens. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, became suddenly busy whenever Jacob needed metalwork done. Even some parents who had praised Li Mei's teaching began keeping their children home from school on days when she was scheduled to help. Li Mei felt the shift in community attitude like a physical weight. She had experienced prejudice before, but this was different, more personal, more deliberate, more designed to destroy not just her reputation but her spirit. "Maybe I should leave," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. "Go to another territory. Start over somewhere else." Jacob looked at her with alarm. "Is that what you want?" Li Mei was quiet for a long moment, her fingers playing with her jade bracelet. "What I want is to belong somewhere. To have a place where I can use my skills to help people, where children can learn and grow, where I don't have to hide who I am or pretend to be less than I am." "You have that here," Jacob said firmly. "Do I?" Li Mei's voice carried a weight of sadness that made Jacob's chest ache. "Half the town thinks I'm your concubine. The other half thinks I'm a dangerous foreign influence. Dr. Webb offers me opportunities, but Buck Henley threatens to destroy anyone who supports me. How long before even Sarah Walsh decides I'm too much trouble?" As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the evening air. But instead of the hostile group they had learned to expect, this was a single rider, Sarah Walsh herself, her face grim with purpose. "Sarah," Jacob called as she dismounted, "what brings you out so late?" Sarah's expression was tight with barely controlled anger. "I came to warn you. There's going to be a town meeting tomorrow night. Buck's been organizing it, claiming it's about community standards and moral leadership." Li Mei's face went pale. "They want to force me to leave." "Some of them do," Sarah admitted, "but not all. Dr. Webb is still in town, and he's made it clear that the territorial government supports your work. Judge Morrison has questions about the recent property damage at your ranch, and there are parents who won't stand by quietly while their children's education is threatened." Jacob stood up, pacing to the porch railing as he tried to process this information. "What kind of meeting? What are they planning? Buck's calling it a moral inventory of the community, Sarah said with obvious disgust. He wants to put Li Mei's presence here to a public vote, claiming that decent people shouldn't have to tolerate inappropriate influences on their children. Li Mei rose from her chair, her spine straight with determination. Then we go to this meeting. We answer their questions. We defend what we believe is right. Sarah looked worried. Li Mei, you don't understand how ugly these things can get. Buck's been drinking heavily, and his supporters are angry about changes they don't understand. It could be dangerous. More dangerous than hiding? Li Mei asked. More dangerous than letting fear decide how we live our lives? Jacob moved to stand beside her, his decision made. She's right. We face this together, in front of the whole community. Let people hear the truth instead of Buck's rumors. But even as they made this brave declaration, none of them could shake the feeling that tomorrow night would bring more than just a meeting. The tension that had been building for weeks was approaching a breaking point, and when it finally exploded, the consequences would change everything. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the prairie, echoing like the sound of approaching war drums. The storm that had been gathering wasn't just in the sky. It was in the hearts of people who had been pushed too far and were finally ready to fight back. Li Mei touched her jade bracelet one more time, drawing strength from its connection to the strong women who had come before her. Tomorrow night, she would need every bit of that strength. The battle for her place in America was about to begin in earnest. Sarah Walsh mounted her horse and prepared to leave, but she turned back with one final warning. Li Mei, Jacob, whatever happens tomorrow night, remember that you have more friends in this community than you know, but you also have enemies who won't stop until they've destroyed you both. As she rode away into the gathering darkness, her words hung in the air like a prophecy. The time for quiet perseverance was over. Now came the time for courage, for truth-telling, and for discovering whether love and justice could triumph over hatred and fear. The storm was coming, and there was nowhere left to hide. The Cedar Creek Community Hall buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a knife as nearly every adult in the territory crowded into the cramped wooden building. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on walls that had witnessed barn dances and harvest celebrations. But tonight the atmosphere crackled with something far more dangerous than festive energy. Buck Henley stood at the front of the room like a preacher preparing to deliver a sermon about sin and salvation, his face flushed with the righteous fury of a man convinced he was fighting for civilization itself. Behind him, a hand-painted banner proclaimed, "Community Standards Meeting," in bold black letters that seemed to loom over the assembled crowd like a judgment. Li Mei entered through the back door with Jacob at her side, and conversations died as heads turned to stare. She wore her best dress, the blue cotton Sarah Walsh had helped her choose, and her black hair was pinned back with the kind of dignity that couldn't be purchased or borrowed. The jade bracelet on her wrist caught the lamplight as she walked, straight-backed and unafraid, to seats in the middle section where her supporters had gathered. Dr. Webb sat in the front row, his notebook open and his pen ready, while Judge Morrison occupied his customary place behind a small table that served as both podium and symbol of legal authority. Sarah Walsh had positioned herself strategically near the center aisle, where she could intervene if discussions became too heated. "Friends and neighbors," Buck began, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this speech many times. "We've gathered tonight to address a situation that threatens the very foundation of our community values." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some approving, others skeptical. Li Mei sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but Jacob could see the tension in her shoulders. "For too long, we've allowed outside influences to corrupt our children's education and undermine the moral fabric that holds decent society together," Buck continued, his eyes finding Li Mei in the crowd. "Tonight, we must decide whether Cedar Creek will remain a place where Christian values and American traditions guide our choices, or whether we'll surrender to foreign ideas that threaten everything our fathers died to protect." "What foreign ideas?" called out Tom Patterson from the middle of the room. "Teaching children to read better? Helping them understand mathematics? Because that's what I've seen Li Mei doing with my daughter." Buck's prepared speech faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. It ain't just about book learning, Tom. It's about the example being set. We got an unmarried woman living in sin with a bachelor, teaching our children that proper moral behavior don't matter. What kind of message does that send? Lee May felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, an unexpected voice spoke from the back of the room. The message it sends, said elderly Mrs. Chen, no relation to Lee May, despite the shared surname, is that hard work and kindness matter more than gossip and prejudice. All heads turned toward the 80-year-old widow who rarely spoke at public gatherings. Mrs. Chen had lost her husband in an Indian raid 5 years earlier and had been struggling to maintain her small farm ever since. Lee May came to my place last week when I was sick with fever, Mrs. Chen continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She brought medicine made from plants, she gathered herself, and she sat with me all night to make sure the fever broke. She didn't ask for payment. She didn't lecture me about Christian duty. She just helped because I needed help. Buck's face reddened. That's all very touching, Mrs. Chen, but it don't change the fact that… The fact that what? Dr. Webb's cultured voice cut through Buck's bluster like a sword through silk. Mr. Henley, in my 3 days in Cedar Creek, I've witnessed Miss Chen's teaching methods, interviewed parents about their children's progress, and reviewed test scores that show remarkable improvement. I've also made inquiries about the recent property damage at Mr. Morrison's ranch. The room fell silent. Dr. Webb stood and faced the crowd with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The territorial government takes a dim view of vigilante justice, Mr. Henley. Destroying livestock, damaging property, and intimidating law-abiding citizens are serious crimes, regardless of the motivation behind them. Buck's confident demeanor cracked visibly. I don't know nothing about any property damage. Perhaps not directly, Dr. Webb replied smoothly. But as the acknowledged leader of opposition to Miss Chen's presence here, you bear responsibility for the actions of your followers. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and stood up behind his makeshift podium. Dr. Webb raises an important point. We've had multiple reports of suspicious activity around the Morrison Ranch, and I intend to investigate fully. But tonight's meeting was called to discuss educational policy, not to conduct a criminal investigation. Buck seized on this attempt to redirect the conversation. Exactly, Judge. And the question before us is simple. Do we want our children educated by someone who shares our values and beliefs, or by a foreign heathen who don't understand American ways? Lee May had listened to these attacks in silence long enough. She rose from her seat with fluid grace, and something in her movement commanded attention more effectively than shouting could have done. Mr. Henley, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, you speak often of American values, but I wonder if you truly understand what they are. Buck opened his mouth to interrupt, but Lee May continued before he could speak. I have spent months studying your Constitution, your Declaration of Independence, your history of welcoming people from distant places who seek better lives for their families. These documents speak of equality before the law, of justice without regard to birth or nationality, of the right to pursue happiness through honest work. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. You accuse me of not understanding American ways, but I have embraced the most American principle of all, the belief that people should be judged by their actions, not by the color of their skin or the place of their birth. The hall erupted in competing voices, some cheering Lee May's words, others shouting agreement with Buck's position. Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Furthermore, Lee May said, raising her voice above the noise, you question my moral character because I live and work alongside Mr. Morrison without the blessing of marriage. But I ask you this, which is more moral, a relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose, or a marriage built on ownership and submission? The question hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Several women nodded thoughtfully, while their husbands shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah Walsh stood up, her teacher's authority evident in her posture. I'd like to say something about Lee May's character, she announced, and the room gradually quieted. I've worked alongside this woman for weeks now, and I've never seen anyone more dedicated to helping children learn and grow. She arrives early, stays late, and gives her best effort to every student, regardless of their background or ability. Sarah's voice grew passionate as she continued. Some of you are worried about foreign influences, but let me tell you what I've observed. Lee May has taught our children to think more clearly, work more cooperatively, and treat each other with greater respect. If those are foreign influences, then I pray we get more of them. The tide of opinion was shifting, and Buck could sense it. His next words came out harsh and desperate. Pretty speeches don't change facts, he shouted. This woman is living in sin, corrupting our children with heathen ideas, and undermining everything decent people stand for. If we don't stop this now, what's next? Are we going to let every foreign devil who shows up think they can? He never finished the sentence. Jacob Morrison had risen from his seat and was walking toward the front of the room with the deliberate stride of a man who had reached his breaking point. That's enough, Jacob said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the hall. Lee May has shown more courage, more wisdom, and more Christian charity than anyone in this room. If you want to attack someone's character, Buck Henley, then attack mine. But you will not use that kind of language about the woman I intend to marry. The announcement hit the crowd like a lightning strike. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and even Buck stood with his mouth hanging open in shock. Lee May felt her heart skip as Jacob's words sank in. They had discussed their feelings privately, but this public declaration changed everything. Jacob turned to face Lee May, his eyes holding a question and a promise. Lee May Chen, will you marry me? Will you be my wife before God and all these witnesses? The packed hall held its breath as Lee May rose from her seat. Her jade bracelet caught the lamplight as she walked toward Jacob, her face radiant with joy and determination. Yes, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. I will marry you, Jacob Morrison, and I will be proud to call Cedar Creek my home. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, though not from everyone. Buck Henley's supporters looked stunned by this unexpected turn of events, while Lee May's allies celebrated what felt like a victory for love over hatred. But even as Jacob and Lee May embraced, both knew that Buck Henley's rage had only intensified. The public humiliation would demand revenge, and a man like Buck wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than total destruction of those who had defied him. The battle was far from over. Judge Morrison's voice boomed through the celebrating crowd like a cannon shot, bringing the impromptu engagement party to an abrupt halt. Since we're all here, and since I have the legal authority to perform marriages, why don't we make this official right now? The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through Lee May's supporters, but Buck Henley's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. His carefully planned meeting to drive Lee May out of town was transforming into a celebration of everything he despised. You can't be serious, Buck sputtered, his voice cracking with disbelief. A marriage between a white man and a blank and a what, Mr. Henley? Dr. Webb's icy tone cut through Buck's stammering. A human being? An American resident? A woman of exceptional character and intelligence? Lee May looked around the packed hall, seeing faces that reflected the full spectrum of human emotion. Joy, anger, confusion, hope, and hatred, all mixed together like colors on an artist's palette. This wasn't how she had imagined her wedding day, but something about the spontaneous nature of it felt perfectly right. Jacob, she said softly, taking his hands in hers, are you certain? Once we do this, there will be no taking it back. Buck and his friends will never forgive us. Jacob's smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words anyway. Lee May, I was certain the day I met you. Everything since then has just been waiting for the right moment. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and pulled a small leather book from his coat pocket. Well then, if both parties are willing, let's proceed. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Jacob and Lee May spoke their vows with voices that carried clearly through the hall, their words simple but profound. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers that erupted could be heard all the way to the next county. But not everyone was celebrating. Buck Henley stood frozen in place, his face cycling through expressions of rage, disbelief, and something that looked almost like grief. The world he understood, where people stayed in their assigned places and outsiders knew their limits, was crumbling before his eyes. As the crowd began to disperse, with many people stopping to congratulate the new couple, Buck finally found his voice. "This ain't over," he said, his words directed at Jacob and Lee May, but spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you've won something here tonight, but you ain't seen nothing yet." Dr. Webb stepped between Buck and the newlyweds, his professional demeanor masking what appeared to be genuine anger. "Mr. Henley, are you threatening these people?" Buck's mouth opened and closed like it was having trouble forming words. "I'm just saying, there are consequences to defying the natural order of things. Consequences that government officials and fancy judges can't protect them from." "Is that so?" Judge Morrison's voice carried the full weight of territorial law. "Because it sounds to me like you're making threats against law-abiding citizens." "That's a serious crime, Mr. Henley." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Pete Rawlings, one of Buck's longtime supporters, stepped forward and placed a restraining hand on his friend's arm. "Come on, Buck," Pete said quietly. "We've said our piece. Time to go home." Buck allowed himself to be led away, but his parting glare promised that this humiliation would not go unanswered. As he and his remaining supporters filed out of the hall, their angry muttering created an undercurrent of menace that cast a shadow over the celebration. Lee May Morrison, she would have to get used to her new name, watched them leave with mixed emotions. Victory felt sweet, but she knew enough about men like Buck Henley to understand that defeat only made them more dangerous. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "I am thinking," Lee May replied carefully, "that we have won an important battle tonight, but the war is not over." Dr. Webb approached them with a warm smile and an extended hand. "Mrs. Morrison, congratulations on your marriage. I hope this means you'll be staying in Cedar Creek permanently?" Lee May exchanged a glance with Jacob before answering. "Dr. Webb, I believe Cedar Creek is my home now, but I am curious about the teaching opportunities you mentioned earlier." "Ah, yes." Dr. Webb's eyes lit up with professional enthusiasm. "The territorial government is establishing a teacher training program. We need someone with your innovative methods to travel to other communities and help establish proper schools. The position would involve significant travel, but the salary would be excellent, and the impact on frontier education could be transformative." Jacob felt a moment of panic at the thought of Lee May leaving, even temporarily, but one look at her face told him how much this opportunity meant to her. "It would mean being away from home for weeks at a time," Lee May said, clearly torn between ambition and loyalty. "Then we'll make it work," Jacob said firmly. "I can manage the ranch for a few weeks at a stretch, and the territory needs what you have to offer." Sarah Walsh, who had been listening to this conversation with growing excitement, stepped forward with a proposal. "What if I went with you? I have teaching experience, and I could help with the administrative aspects of setting up new schools." The idea energized everyone involved. Dr. Webb began outlining possibilities. Communities throughout Wyoming Territory were desperate for qualified teachers, and Lee May's methods could revolutionize frontier education. But even as they made plans for the future, the shadow of Buck Henley's threats loomed over their celebration. Several community members approached Jacob and Lee May with warnings about watching their backs and securing their property. "Buck's not the kind of man who forgives and forgets," warned Tom Patterson. "You folks need to be extra careful over the next few weeks." Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow whose defense of Lee May had surprised everyone, shuffled over with advice that carried the weight of hard experience. "In my country," she said quietly, "we have saying, 'The nail that stands up gets hammered down.' But we also say, 'The bamboo bends in the storm but does not break.' You must be like bamboo now, flexible but strong." As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Jacob and Lee May found themselves alone on the steps of the community hall. The autumn night was crisp and clear, with stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Mrs. Morrison," Jacob said, testing out her new name with obvious pleasure. "Mr. Morrison," Lee May replied, her smile visible even in the dim light. "That will take some getting used to." They walked home together through the quiet streets of Cedar Creek, their footsteps echoing off the wooden sidewalks. Most of the town's windows were dark, but here and there they caught glimpses of lamplight and the shadows of families settling in for the night. "Jacob," Lee May said as they reached their front porch, "I need to tell you something important." The seriousness in her voice made Jacob stop and face her fully. "What is it?" Lee May removed her jade bracelet and held it up so it caught the starlight. "In my family, this has been passed down from mother to daughter for 5 generations. It represents continuity, the connection between past and future." She pressed the bracelet into Jacob's hands. "I give this to you not as a token of submission, but as a symbol of partnership. We are creating something new here, a marriage that honors both our backgrounds, while building something uniquely American." Jacob looked down at the smooth green stone, feeling the weight of tradition and trust it represented. "Are you sure? This is your connection to your family, your heritage." "No," Lee May said firmly. "You are my connection to the future. This bracelet will be passed down to our children, carrying stories of both China and America, of courage and love conquering fear and hatred." As they stood together on their porch, husband and wife at last, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line beyond their property. Buck Henley sat motionless on his horse, his face twisted with an emotion that went far beyond simple prejudice or social disapproval. This was personal now. The public humiliation, the legal threats, the community's rejection of his leadership, all of it demanded payback that would be swift, decisive, and final. The real test of Jacob and Lee May's love was about to begin. Fire erupted from Jacob and Lee May's barn like an angry orange beast devouring everything in its path, the flames reaching toward the star-filled Wyoming sky with greedy fingers that turned night into blazing day. Lee May woke to the smell of smoke and the terrified screaming of animals trapped inside the burning structure, her heart hammering against her ribs as she shook Jacob awake. "The barn!" she gasped, pointing toward their bedroom window where hellish light danced across the glass. "Jacob, the animals!" They tumbled from bed and raced outside in their nightclothes, the heat hitting their faces like a physical blow even from 50 yards away. Thunder and the other horses were throwing themselves against their stall doors in wild panic, while the milk cow bellowed in terror from somewhere deep inside the inferno. Jacob grabbed a bucket and sprinted toward the well, but Lee May caught his arm with desperate strength. "It's too late for water," she shouted over the roar of flames. "We have to get the animals out now, or they'll die." Without waiting for his response, she pulled her nightgown over her nose and mouth and ran straight toward the barn's main door. Jacob cursed and followed, his bare feet slipping on the frost-covered ground as he chased his wife into what looked like the mouth of hell itself. Inside the barn, the air was thick with smoke that burned their lungs and brought tears streaming down their faces. Lee May moved with surprising calm through the chaos, speaking to the panicked animals in soothing Chinese while she fumbled with door latches that were almost too hot to touch. "Take Thunder," she called to Jacob, who was wrestling with the gate to the cow's stall. "I'll get the others." The next 10 minutes passed in a blur of smoke, flame, and desperate struggle. One by one, they led or carried the animals to safety, their hands blistered from hot metal and their lungs raw from breathing smoke. Thunder was the hardest. The massive horse was so frightened he nearly trampled Jacob in his rush to escape the burning building. By the time they collapsed on the grass, coughing and gasping for clean air, the barn was completely engulfed. Neighbors had begun arriving, drawn by the orange glow visible for miles across the prairie. But there was nothing anyone could do except watch years of hard work turn to ash and ember. "Everyone's safe," Lee May whispered, her voice barely audible through her smoke-damaged throat. "The animals are all safe." Jacob pulled his wife against his chest, both of them shaking from exhaustion and shock. Around them, neighbors formed a circle of concerned faces. Sarah Walsh, Tom Patterson, Mrs. Prodderson, Chen, and a dozen others who had ridden through the night to help. But it was Sarah who voiced what everyone was thinking. "This wasn't an accident," she said grimly, pointing to something that glinted in the firelight near what had been the barn door. "That's a kerosene can. Someone set this fire deliberately." Judge Morrison arrived just as the barn's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks that rose toward the heavens like angry fireflies. He examined the evidence with the careful attention of a man who had investigated too many crimes, motivated by hatred and fear. Arson, he pronounced after several minutes of study. Professional job, too. Whoever did this knew exactly how to make sure the fire spread fast and burned hot. Li Mei struggled to her feet, swaying slightly from smoke inhalation but determined to stand tall. "Buck Henley," she said simply. "Can you prove it?" Judge Morrison asked. "I saw him," called a voice from the darkness beyond the circle of neighbors. Everyone turned as Dr. Webb emerged from the shadows, his usually immaculate clothing disheveled and his face grim. "I couldn't sleep, so I was walking near my hotel when I saw Buck Henley riding hell for leather away from this direction about an hour ago." The evidence was damning, but Jacob knew that Buck's influence still ran deep in certain parts of the community. Seeing him ride at night isn't the same as catching him with a torch in his hand, he said wearily. "No," Judge Morrison agreed, "but it's enough to bring him in for questioning, along with a few of his closest supporters." As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of their barn, Jacob and Li Mei sat on their porch steps, sharing a cup of coffee that Sarah Walsh had prepared from their kitchen supplies. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air, and everything they owned smelled like a campfire. "Are you sorry you married me?" Li Mei asked quietly, her voice still hoarse from the smoke. Jacob looked at her with amazement. "Sorry? Li Mei? You ran into a burning building to save our animals. You risked your life without thinking twice about it. How could I be anything but proud to call you my wife?" Li Mei managed a small smile. "In China, there is a saying, crisis reveals character. I think last night revealed who we really are." "And what did it reveal?" "That we are stronger together than either of us could be alone," Li Mei replied. "That we will fight for what we believe in, even when the cost is high." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more visitors, but these weren't neighbors coming to offer sympathy. Buck Henley rode up with Pete Rawlings and two other men, their faces set in expressions of false concern that fooled no one. "Heard you folks had some trouble last night," Buck called out, his voice carrying just enough smugness to make Jacob's hands clench into fists. "Terrible thing, losing a barn like that. Good thing nobody was hurt." Judge Morrison stepped out from behind the house, where he'd been examining more evidence, and Buck's confident expression faltered slightly. "Mr. Henley," the judge said formally, "I need you to come with me for questioning regarding last night's fire." Buck's mask of false sympathy slipped completely. "On what grounds? I was home all evening, wasn't I, boys?" His companions nodded eagerly, but their obvious rehearsal made their alibis less convincing rather than more. "On the grounds that you were seen in this area around the time the fire started," Judge Morrison replied, "and on the grounds that you've made numerous threats against Mr. and Mrs. Morrison in recent weeks." The standoff stretched tight as a bowstring until Dr. Webb stepped forward with news that changed everything. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of the territorial government, "I've just received a telegram from the capital. The territorial legislature has passed new laws regarding violence motivated by racial prejudice. Arson committed as an act of intimidation against immigrants is now a federal crime, punishable by up to 20 years in prison." Buck's face went white as the implications sank in. What had seemed like simple frontier justice was now a matter that could involve federal marshals and territorial courts. "Furthermore," Dr. Webb continued, "I'm authorized to offer a reward of $500 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever committed this crime." $500 was more money than most frontier residents saw in 2 years. The offer created an immediate shift in the dynamics of the situation, as Buck's supporters began to consider whether their loyalty was worth that much potential trouble. Pete Rawlings was the first to crack. "Buck," he said quietly, "maybe we should." "Shut up, Pete," Buck snarled, but the damage was done. Judge Morrison had heard the nervousness in Pete's voice and recognized the signs of a man ready to confess. "Mr. Rawlings," the judge said smoothly, "perhaps you'd like to accompany me to town for a private conversation?" I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone involved." As the legal machinery began to grind into motion, Lee May stood up and walked over to where Buck sat on his horse, still defiant despite the walls closing in around him. "Mr. Henley," she said clearly, her smoke-damaged voice somehow carrying more authority than his bluster, "you burned our barn because you hate what I represent. But you cannot burn down ideas. You cannot destroy the fact that America is big enough for all kinds of people, all kinds of dreams." Buck stared down at her with undisguised loathing. "You think you've won something, but you ain't. There are more like me out there, and we won't let you foreigners take over what our fathers built." Lee May nodded sadly. "You are right that there are more like you, but there are also more like us, people who believe in justice, in fairness, in judging others by their actions rather than their appearance. And we are not going anywhere." As Buck and his friends were escorted toward town for questioning, Jacob put his arm around Lee May's shoulders and surveyed the smoking ruins of their barn. "It's going to take months to rebuild," he said. "Then we rebuild," Lee May replied simply. "And when we do, we make it stronger than before." The first chapter of their story was ending, but Lee May could already see the beginning of the next one. Buck Henley had tried to drive her away with fear and violence, but all he had accomplished was proving that she belonged here, not as a victim or an outsider, but as a full citizen of Wyoming Territory, ready to fight for her place in America. The pride of the plains had been tested by fire, and she had not been found wanting. 6 months later, Lee May Morrison stood before the largest crowd ever assembled in Cedar Creek, her voice carrying clearly across the packed town square where a platform had been erected for the dedication ceremony. The new school building rose behind her like a monument to possibility, its fresh-cut timber and gleaming windows reflecting the spring sunshine that had finally melted the last of winter's snow. "When I first arrived in your community," Lee May began, her English now flawless and confident, "I was a stranger who spoke a different language and carried the dust of distant places on my clothes. Some of you saw me as a threat to everything familiar and comfortable." In the crowd, she could see faces that had once regarded her with suspicion now listening with respectful attention. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly from the front row, while Tom Bradley smiled and whispered something to his wife about how much their son had improved in his studies. "But others," Lee May continued, her eyes finding Jacob among the listeners, "saw something different. They saw someone who needed a chance, someone who might have gifts to offer if given the opportunity to share them." Dr. Webb sat on the platform behind her, beaming with the satisfaction of a man whose gamble had paid off spectacularly. In the past 6 months, Lee May had traveled to 12 different communities throughout Wyoming Territory, establishing schools and training teachers in methods that had become known as the Morrison system throughout educational circles. "Today, we dedicate not just a building but a promise," Lee May said, her voice growing stronger as she reached the heart of her message. "A promise that in America, worth is not determined by the place of your birth or the color of your skin, but by the content of your character and the contributions you make to your community." The crowd erupted in applause, but Lee May wasn't finished. She had one more surprise to share. "This school represents the partnership between old and new, between the wisdom of experience and the innovation of fresh ideas. Therefore, I am honored to announce that Mrs. Sarah Walsh has agreed to serve as the first principal of the Cedar Creek Advanced Academy, while I will continue my work training teachers throughout the territory." Sarah Walsh rose from her seat, tears streaming down her face as the crowd cheered her appointment. The friendship between the two women had deepened through months of collaboration, creating an educational team that territorial officials considered the finest on the frontier. But the real celebration began when Judge Morrison stepped forward with an announcement that surprised everyone, including Lee May herself. "Mrs. Morrison," he said formally, "by the authority granted to me by the territorial government, I am pleased to inform you that your application for full American citizenship has been approved. You are now, in every legal sense, an American citizen with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." The crowd exploded in cheers that could be heard for miles across the prairie, Li Mei felt tears streaming down her face as the full impact of the moment hit her. She was no longer a refugee, no longer a stranger, no longer someone whose place in America depended on the goodwill of others. She was home. Jacob pushed through the crowd to reach the platform, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. When he reached Li Mei, he pulled her into his arms and spun her around as the crowd continued to cheer. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Li Mei Morrison, American citizen?" he asked, his voice full of pride and love. "It feels," Li Mei said, laughing through her tears, "like the beginning of everything I was meant to be." The celebration continued long into the evening, with families sharing food and stories on blankets spread across the town square. Children who had been Li Mei's first students performed a program of songs and recitations that showcased the remarkable progress they had made under her innovative teaching methods. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow who had defended Li Mei during the dark days of Buck Henley's campaign, approached with a gift wrapped in silk cloth. "This belonged to my grandmother," Mrs. Chen said, unwrapping a delicate tea set decorated with painted birds and flowers. "She brought it from the old country when she was young, just as you brought your wisdom from China. I want you to have it, to remember that America is made stronger by the gifts its immigrants bring." Li Mei accepted the tea set with trembling hands, understanding that it represented more than just porcelain and paint. It was a symbol of continuity, of the way traditions could be preserved while adapting to new circumstances. As the sun set behind the mountains and the celebration began to wind down, Li Mei found herself standing with Jacob on a small hill overlooking the town. Cedar Creek spread out below them like a patchwork quilt, its windows glowing with warm light as families settled in for the evening. "Do you ever think about Buck?" Jacob asked quietly. Li Mei nodded. Buck Henley was serving a 5-year sentence in the territorial prison, his conviction for arson having been secured when Pete Rawlings finally testified against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. The violence had ended, but the attitudes that motivated it still existed in some hearts. "I think about him," Li Mei said, "but not with anger. I think about him with sadness, because he could never see past his fear to understand what we were really trying to build here." "And what were we trying to build?" Li Mei smiled and touched the jade bracelet on her wrist, the same bracelet that would someday be passed down to their children, carrying stories of courage and love from one generation to the next. "We were trying to build America," she said simply, "the real America, where people are judged by their character rather than their ancestry, where immigrants don't have to abandon their heritage to become citizens, where strength comes from diversity rather than uniformity." In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, the same railroad that had brought Li Mei to Wyoming Territory as a frightened refugee. But now the sound filled her with excitement rather than fear, because she knew that train was carrying other dreamers, other seekers, other people ready to contribute their gifts to the great American experiment. "Jacob," Li Mei said softly, "I have news to share." Something in her tone made him turn to face her fully. "What kind of news?" Li Mei placed his hand on her still flat stomach and smiled. "The kind of news that means our story is just beginning. The kind that means there will be another generation to carry on what we've started here." Jacob's whoop of joy echoed across the valley, causing heads to turn in their direction from the celebration below. He swept Li Mei into his arms and spun her around again, both of them laughing with the pure delight of two people who had found love, purpose, and belonging in the vast promise of the American frontier. As they walked back down the hill toward their home, Li Mei reflected on the journey that had brought her from the darkness of Buck Henley's saloon to this moment of triumph and joy. She had arrived in Wyoming Territory as property to be sold, but she was leaving this day as Li Mei Morrison, teacher, wife, mother-to-be, and proud American citizen. The pride of the plains had found her place at last, not through conquest or submission, but through the simple act of being herself with courage, dignity, and unwavering determination to build something better. And in the years to come, when her children and grandchildren asked about the early days of their family in America, Lee May would tell them that the secret to success wasn't in changing who you are to fit someone else's expectations. The secret was in being brave enough to become who you were always meant to be.